introduction. I've learned so much from you over the years, so it feels so nice to be introduced by you. I'm gonna start my presentation. Let's see. Oh, I have to share my slides first. Share my screen, right? Let's see. Okay. And then I should be in full screen. Can everyone see my slides? Or I can't see you, so if we can get a verbal confirmation.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you so much for that warm introduction, Nicole. So I'm honored to kick off the workshop series as one of the talks today. I think it's almost the last talk. I think there's one more after me, but super honored to be contributing to this project. Super important. My talk today is called Keep True: 3 Strategies to Guide AI Engagement. Obligatory, I have to say greetings from Mordor. I live in Las Vegas. It's very hot here. I'm wearing a suit jacket anyways for you all. So that's my contribution to professionalism for today. Greetings from Mordor. As Nicole mentioned, I work at the Center for Research Libraries. I'm the director for Information Systems and Technology Strategy. We started in 1949, which is maybe not that long for many of the institutions in England, but in the US, I think we're doing okay for longevity. We're a consortium of more than 200 research libraries, primarily in the United States and Canada, though we have aspirations to grow internationally at a greater scale. The AEOLIAN network, I hope I'm saying that right. This is where I feel like a crude American and maybe not being able to pronounce this correctly. Super important project. I've been really fascinated by the work that this group has done to bring various kinds of cultural heritage organizations together around the potential of AI. And I think you can see a lot of the really intentional design in the workshop today and in the workshops that will follow. And I hope that you all will continue to tune in and participate in these workshops. I had to look up what AEOLIAN was, again, being the crude American. And I think that it's a reference to the god of wind. I hope that's right. And so I imagine that there's some sort of sense that this project is going to do some uplift for our community as we engage these technologies. But at the same time, I also think it's kind of evocative in the sense that when we think about the potential of artificial intelligence, we are also buffeted by not a small amount of marketing jargon and like meaningless crap, honestly, about the potential of AI. And it can be difficult to navigate that. So super impressed by the talks today, because I think they're helping us get through this sort of maelstrom of hype and get us closer to being like our individual storms of our various cultural heritage organizations working to harness the power of AI to increase equity for our respective communities. I think that GLAMs have an opportunity to distinguish themselves in their use of AI. And while the component parts of this community are quite different and sometimes functionally opposed in their approaches to similar work, we know this, if you've worked as an archivist and have ever had a conversation with a museum professional and a librarian, we share some things in common, but we also do things very differently. The one thing that we definitely share in common, I believe, is a set of contemporary commitments that seek to advance equity in the communities we serve. And in what follows, I'm going to hope to present, internet connection willing, 3 strategies I believe strengthen our ability to realize these commitments, something that I call a non-scalability imperative, avoiding neoliberal traps, and seeing maintenance as innovation. So this is roughly the agenda for my talk today, just 3 things: non-scalability imperative, neoliberal traps, maintenance as innovation. First thing that I'll discuss is the non-scalability imperative. And so for me, I kind of translate that as whenever we see a call for scalability in the use of AI, we must look for the non-scalable elements that scalability is predicated on. And we must determine whether scale is worth the costs that it seeks to hide. I'm, fundamentally inspired by, in terms of my thinking in this way, by Anna Tsing, who wrote a fantastic and evocative work called The Mushroom at the End of the World on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. And if you don't have time to pick up or read the monograph right now, I recommend you read her article on non-scalability. The living world is not amenable to precision nested scales, wherein Tsing says, there is something disturbingly beautiful about precision, even when we know it fails us. Scalability is, indeed, a triumph of precision design, not just in computers, but in business, development, the conquest of nature, and more generally, world-making. Yet it disguises divisions by blocking our ability to notice the heterogeneity of the world. By its design, scalability allows us to see only uniform blocks, ready for further expansion. And Tsing has this wonderful anecdote or use case that she includes both in the article and the book about matsutake mushroom cultivation, a story in order to illustrate the point about the tensions between scalability and non-scalability. So she tells the story that every year, matsutake mushrooms, a delicious mushroom, seasonal, show up in markets around the world, neatly packaged, ready for consumption. They show up on our shelves. We get excited. It's matsutake time. And then we grab the matsutake from the shelves, neatly packaged, available most everywhere. We are told that they come from forests, beautiful forests, and that as the seasons turn, the mushrooms are made available to us. And then they come to us and they're packaged, ready for consumption. However, the reality is a little bit more complicated. The mushrooms, or the forests that the mushrooms tend to be cultivated from, are often the ruins of come from the ruins of industrial forests, massive, densely planted forests that are primarily meant for timber consumption. And in the ruins of these forests, either from logging or more often from fires that are more often than not precipitated by our current climate disaster, matsutake mushrooms really flourish in the ruins, basically. And the way that they are cultivated is predominantly by an itinerant migrant workforce. So there's all these levels of precarity or non-scalability that support the illusion of scalability. So if we look to the right here of this, very happy woman grabbing lots of boxes of cereal, and if we could imagine, these neatly packaged mushrooms instead, what Tsing is trying to get at is, trying to provide this lens of sight for us called non-scalability that causes us to question, anytime we encounter something in our lives, whether or not it's a product or an artificial intelligence service, say, hosted on the cloud somewhere, and there's all this, marketing language around scale, that we really need to dig deeper and question claims to scale to get a sense of what the layer cake is, all the various layers of non-scalable processes that are commodified and that prop up a purportedly scalable thing. As Tsing says, scalable projects are everywhere and perhaps inextricably linked with non-scalable worlds. And so it's a bit jarring when we go from that perspective to recent headlines around the potential of AI. Scale is everywhere. AI spend rises as enterprises solve for scale. Neurala raises $12 million to scale AI for manufacturing. And this is from Microsoft, the last one, the next generation of AI from language models to scale. Scale.com, these are their fundamental functions: annotation, managing, automating, evaluating, collecting, generating. No mentions or documentation here for the non-scalable elements that make something like Scale.com possible, or any of its services for that matter. That's all kind of hidden away as a mystery. In this mode of thought, heterogeneity becomes a problem to solve rather than an opportunity to engage with. The point becomes more salient in recent research. This article, the values encoded in machine learning research, did an analysis of 100 highly cited machine learning papers, trying to get a sense of, what were the claimed values in these highly cited machine learning papers. And what they found was that societal needs were typically very loosely connected to the choice of the project, if mentioned at all. And the consideration of negative consequences in these papers was extremely rare. And furthermore, they found an increasingly close tie between highly cited papers, tech companies, and elite universities. This is a visualization of the distribution of uplifted values in each of the papers. And I'll zoom in on this a little bit. So on the far left-hand side, we get very, very high up in the claimed values in these highly cited papers, references to scale, to performance, to efficiency, to quantitative evidence, to generalization. The humanists in the audience are probably, I imagine, cringing right now. A generalization as a primary value. That's the most positive thing. And then far to the right, where I've added my meme here, the burning dog, the this is fine, we see that apparently the least claimed values are things like privacy, user influence, non-maleficence, safety, social bias, fairness, respect for law and public interest, explicability, autonomy, or the power to decide, respect for persons, and with an almost non-existent representation in these highly cited papers, the notion that AI should be just. There's the 30,000-foot view. This is my contribution to the AI meme discourse. I hope it's helpful, but pretty dark. Not great. When we get preferences like this in terms of values that should be uplifted, it's not surprising that we get things like facial recognition that can't recognize Black people, or that we get researchers that think it's a good idea to develop systems to try and do recognition of gay or homosexual faces. Or we have things like on the dangers of stochastic parrots, can language models be too big, by Bender, Gabru, McMillan, Major, and Schmitchell, which does something really great. They're just really trying to get a sense of, for these large language models that are being developed in the private sector, what are the environmental and financial costs? Right? What are the non-scalable elements of a purportedly scalable project, endlessly scalable project that only needs more computing resources? What are the non-scalable realities that leads to the very high-profile firing of Timnit Gebru at Google, one of the most prominent AI ethicists in the world? Very disturbing. We need a theory of non-scalability. We need attention to the wild diversity of life on Earth. And that requires something like Singh's theory of non-scalability to be operationalized in our daily work. So I would say, whenever we see a call for scalability, we must look for the non-scalable elements scalability is predicated on, and we must determine whether scale is worth the costs it seeks to hide. Next in my talk, the notion of neoliberal traps in AI work and GLAMs. As Hunt explains, one of the most common features of contemporary neoliberal moral regulation in everyday life is that judgments about right and wrong ways of thinking and acting are transmitted through proxies of risk, harm, and personal responsibility. An emphasis on individual risks and collective harms is important. Risk-based problems in everyday life are routinely addressed to entrepreneurial citizen subjects who are assumed to be rationally motivated to take personal responsibility to proactively mitigate the likelihood of experiencing harm. This is a trap. Systemic issues require systematic rather than individualized approaches. Positive and equitable AI depends on collective action. When we don't have collective action, we have things like this. We have people trying to do ethical AI, values-aligned AI, fair AI. Who says it's ethical? Who says it's values aligned? Who says that it's fair? And what we get is sort of a replication of well-meaning, individualized attempts at various cultural heritage organizations around the world, essentially just trying to do the right thing. And what we have then is what I call the I am Spartacus moment of trying to do the right thing in the use of AI, trying not to harm communities, where you have an archive saying, I'm Spartacus, and then a museum saying, no, I'm Spartacus, and then a library saying, no, I'm Spartacus. And we're all trying to do the right thing. But, I think ultimately, thinking about the notion of neoliberal moral regulation and the shift that emphasis makes in our thinking from sort of collective problems to individualized rational choice, I think that that's unfair. I think that it's ineffective, and I think that it reduces the potential for us to increase equity in our work. We do have some examples of collective work, the product of many views on how to do this work better, like this toolkit that was released by the Museums and AI Network, this report from SILIP, the impact of AI, machine learning, automation, and robotics on the information professions. I'll throw my own hat in the ring here with my work at OCLC Research on responsible operations that Nicole mentioned at the outset. And I think those are all great sort of initial collective resources. I think a gap in all of my work, and then I'll just say my work because I don't want to speak for the other examples, was highlighted to me very pointedly by our good friend, Professor Melissa Terrace. I was giving a talk late in the fall of 2019 before the release of Responsible Operations, the report that I composed with very, very diverse and robust community feedback, primarily in the United States. I got through an hour-long talk about the report, and then in the Q&A, if you know Melissa Terrace, she's really wonderful, generative, kind collaborator, but also asked some of the most constructively critical, laser-like questions. And she asked me toward the end, she's like, Thomas, this is great work, but how are you going to advocate for this? And I said, well, what do you mean? Or who do you mean too? And she's like, well, how are you going to advocate for with your local government, with legislation to actually get some of these principles enacted or legislated, so there's regulation? And I'll be honest, I didn't have an answer to that. I hadn't even thought of that. And I think that a lot of the work that comes out of the cultural heritage community, not just in the space of AI, but in other areas, often has this blind spot. And so, this was basically me in Edinburgh after Melissa asked that question. Luckily, we went to go get, I think, Italian food after, and then I came out of the bushes and we had a very nice time. But I haven't forgotten this lesson. And so I thought I would repeat it here in this talk today as a point of emphasis. In the United States, we do have organizations like Spark, which does do lobbying and advocacy in Washington, D.C., primarily in open access, open education, and open data. They're a fantastic organization, but we don't really have currently an equivalent to what, say, the EU has in terms of the proposed regulations of artificial intelligence. We just don't really have something like that. We have a lot of scaremongering around racist, Cold War overtone references to a competition with China about AI, which are ridiculous and super counterproductive and not something I ever want to see again. But yeah, I mean, in the EU, there's the legislation for AI and the regulation that's coming, and I think that that's really positive. Some of you in the audience may be thinking, well, that the EU legislation is really problematic, and I had seen this piece from Michael Veal sort of, unpacking some of the problematic aspects of this proposed legislation. But I would also say, yes, this is excellent. We need critiques like this, and I'm happy that they did this. But also in the EU, at least they have something. We don't we don't really have something in the US. And I would love to see us and other countries move more into the space of regulation, because otherwise I don't really see a way for um, the private sector to behave better, and not even just behave better, to not do bad things, to not do things that lead to people dying or being concretely discriminated against. So I'd like to see us move more into the space of legislation. And I think there's a big question mark around what our library associations, archive associations, and museum associations, what our professional associations in the GLAM sector are doing on our behalf in order to advocate for this kind of change as a matter of policy on a national and an international level. I think that's going to be a major growth area for us. Lastly, there's this notion of maintenance as innovation. So when we're thinking about AI, it can't escape the notion that this is this innovative experimental thing for GLAMs, right? Periodically, you'll see talks where people will say something like, well, AI has been around for 60 years or 70 years, and then there was an AI winter, and like there's nothing new about AI. And it's like, that's true, but it also kind of doesn't matter at the same time, because it feels new to the current generation of practitioners. And it's just going to be inevitably seen as something that's like innovative or experimental, yada, 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 right? I guess we can have a history debate later. But I think that one of the things that we need to avoid is this notion that because this is labeled as an innovative thing, that we aim for addressing the potential of AI by hiring a bunch of individual shiny stars at our institutions. We hire the one person who can code really well, or the disaffected data scientist who doesn't want to work in the private sector anymore, or maybe it's the alternative. Maybe it's a data scientist who found their true calling and they just really want to work in libraries, and that's great. But we can't rely on that single person, no matter how good their intentions are, because if there's one thing that we know from recurrent sort of cycles of innovation in libraries, that our solutions for this, by like hiring a single person or like two people or even three people to solve this, as opposed to like a holistic organizational solution, is not useful. And eventually this little firework behind their star runs out, and then they land somewhere on the ground, and then maybe they're in libraries another couple of years, and then they leave their profession, and then everyone's mad about it. And then it takes a new cycle of innovation for someone to get excited. The challenge for us is to not repeat the bad patterns of before, to not have, sort of this constellation of, stars with fireworks running out across our professions. Not good for us as a field. We can do better. I really appreciate this work by a number of folks. It was released June 2019. Information maintenance as a practice of care. If you're working in a GLAM organization and you haven't run into the notion of maintenance or information maintenance or the maintainers, this is an excellent introduction to this area, which really tries to focus on centering the value of maintenance in the work that we do, as opposed to it being sort of just like this drudgery kind of thing that happens behind the scenes. That it is central, that it is important, that it requires an ethics of care in order for our infrastructure to be maintained, in order for it to be possible for us to do innovative work. This is a fantastic piece of work. I recommend that you all read it. I will say that asserted dichotomies between maintenance and innovation don't make any sense at all to me. I think that they are counterproductive, and I think that they needlessly set us against each other. I think that we must value our maintenance work as innovation work. And doing the old humanist trick, if you look into the etymology, innovate comes from the Latin innovare, which actually conveys a sense of renewal. rather than making new. And I think that that's a distinction that makes all the difference. The focus on renewal rather than making new. That is what maintenance is all about. And if you look at it that way, that is what innovation can be all about. So to me, maintenance is the fundamental form of innovation that sustains bodies of information, information systems, and communities. The challenge that lies ahead for us as we, work on maintenance as innovation is that, with our existing staff that are already busy, that we don't stack these quote unquote AI opportunities on top of the workload that they already have. Rather that we think about this in an integrative way, in a holistic way, in a way that individuals from many different parts of a cultural heritage organization, public services, digital scholarship, repository development, technical services, all have a role to play. The possibility is something that more than one person could hold in their hands, and that they have the opportunity to think, reflect, and ask the questions why and what if. So we must value maintenance as innovation. So this is my talk today. I finished a little bit early, but I hope this was useful. It's called Keep True, 3 Strategies to Guide AI Engagement. The 3 strategies being non-scalability imperative, neoliberal traps, and maintenance as innovation. I'll close there for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Fantastic. So I'm going to wait a moment and see what we get in the chat in terms of questions. Okay, while I'm waiting, let me give you a question then. Following up particularly on this maintenance as innovation, there seems to be a considerable amount of overlap between this kind of renewed interest, at least in the US, based on what's been going on here socially, politically, in anti-racist description. And I'm curious what you see it as a kind of opportunity for bringing that community into this conversation about maintenance, right? Because often when I'm thinking about maintenance in the context of AI, it can be a matter of recognizing that a classification does not last forever, that these are constantly shifting and changing. That in general, the data sets that we're using to train these systems need to be attended to. I know in a conversation I had with Joy Willamwini, she was referring to it as AI hygiene. There's just this sort of constant cleaning and attending to things. So any thoughts about relationship between anti-racist description? I'm also thinking about this because I'm trying to bring more people within the libraries into this conversation about AI and helping them to recognize the overlap.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. I think that one of the things that we need to be sensitive to is really sensitive to is around, even if we don't feel that we're presenting AI as solutionism to, say, descriptive practices, I think that there's a fair amount of wariness or concern in the community or in the library community, say technical services community, around, hey, you're just going to throw a computer at it, it's going to solve all of our backlog for digitization and description. I think that one of the things I would really recommend that people read is a recent piece by Dorothy Berry. I think it's called "The House the Archives Built" in the We Hear publication, where she offers a really sort of deft and personal analysis of archival work generally, of challenges around description. And I think the potential of technology. So I guess like one of my initial recommendations would be to just read more things like that to, try and learn and um, establish a language and a set of approaches that helps, bridge between, internal library cultures, right? Because we have the challenge of this um, interdisciplinary thing, right, between information practitioners, I guess you want to call us, and say computer scientists like Joy. But then when we want to come back into the library, then we have the challenge of interprofessional challenges and areas of practice to bridge. And I think that being really aware and engaged with the literature and the conversations, I think would really help. Dorothy's piece is fantastic. I think it's going to become like a core part of archival education. I'm just putting that out there. We're friends. Maybe I'm a little biased, but it is a fantastic piece if you all haven't read it.
All right. There are some questions that come up. I'm going to ask if you would stop sharing your screen so that we can see your face.
Yep.
All right. So from John Decker, do you consider the burden of upskilling to be part of the problem of scalability?
So I consider, and I got to this a bit in responsible operations, the OCLC research report. I think that, as with most things, part of the problem with upskilling, or the upskilling idea, is that oftentimes the folks that are being asked to upskill, their jobs don't really change, right? So it's kind of like they already have a full plate, and then it's like upskill, or see opportunities, or see possibility, or what about this neat AI thing? Basically, they're just not really given the time to make use of that upskilling, one, and then two, oftentimes they're not really given the flexibility to change percentages of their job to operationalize what they learn in the upskilling. So I think that's kind of like frontline. And then I think that there's an additional challenge around not a lot of training for administration. In terms of how to make this change something that's holistic across the organization. And so I identified in that research paper, hopefully we have more resources for not just upskilling in the technical sense, but upskilling in just the sense of management.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, understanding implementation, kind of.
Yeah.
There is another question here. Adrian Stevenson says, I didn't quite get the neoliberal trap. Is it possible to elucidate this trap a little bit more and talk more about?
Yeah, sure. So that was riffing off of something that Sean here had written, and I'm just going to go back through my slides so I can reference them while I'm talking about it. In a piece called Moral Panic and the New Neoliberal Compromise. And essentially what he was saying is that in a neoliberal paradigm, as it affects the concept of moral regulation, the regulation of moral life, things that are right and wrong, that in a similar way that neoliberalism focuses on free market capitalism and individual choice, that sort of tracks over to how we work through moral choices. And that what can happen in that kind of environment is that as we're thinking about even positive things, like how do we do ethical AI, or how do we increase equity for our communities, that our tendency in that environment is to focus on our individual decisions as it pertains to moral regulation and what is right. And what here was problematizing was basically that some challenge should not be individualized, that they should actually be collective. And what the shift that I was making in my argument was that I think that what I've seen over the past few years, and even in some of my own work, is that there's a lot of well-meaning practitioners, and then also institutions that are trying to articulate various statements of principles. And this happens in the private sector too. This is where we have like responsible AI or fair AI or justice-aligned AI. We have all of these like what I call the I am Spartacus moments of all of us trying to put out these statements on how to do it right. And what I think what we actually need more as a point of maturation is honestly collective action that leads to regulation. Right, because at the moment it's kind of like individuals and individual institutions, or maybe groupings of institutions that are saying we'll do it this way, but that's not really like a unifying thing. That's not really like a shared commitment, and it's not bound by law. So I would argue, in order to get away from sort of this neoliberal focus on the individual, that we need to move to the collective, and some in the United States it would be federal regulation.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, and we have a question here from Patrick Stack. Oh, he's just asked what was the article on archival work that Thomas mentioned. Somebody will add that to the chat list. Okay, and then Bart Magnus says, according to you, where should LAMs be taking their first AI steps? Where do they start, beside reading some of the articles that you pointed to make their projects and the results of it better than they would be making just these best efforts like I am Spartacus moment? Is it basically being aware of what you said and see how you can implement that in your projects? How do you see that in practice? So you address that a little bit in terms of, at least in U.S. federal regulation, but what do you mean? What does this look like in terms of actual just LAMs getting started in this area?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. One of the recommendations that I made in the OCLC research agenda, which was released right before the start of the pandemic, which was super timely. And that was sarcasm if it didn't come across. But one of the recommendations was, we have sort of like what I called archipelagic sort of data set development to support AI and GLAMs, and uses of things like object recognition or automated transcription. Or at Indiana, they're working with moving images to do like scene segmentation. There's a lot of like archipelagic stuff, but there's not a lot of like shared. And I'm not even like the biggest like fan of empiricism. I'll just put that out there. I'm a humanist, but I do think it would be helpful to have some collective empirical work, because at the moment I mainly see presentations where an institution will be like, I use machine learning and I recognized 100,000 chairs. And it's kind of like, that's really cool that you recognized 100,000 chairs, but are we developing collectively like a best approach to develop historical chairs? I don't know if we are. So I think that it would be helpful for us to have more venues, like we already have, honestly, in the information retrieval community. I know that Stephen Downey is on this call, and I'm thinking about Murex, the music information retrieval community, and they have a conference, and I think every year they have competitions for information retrieval tasks on shared data sets. And I think it would be super positive to have an equivalent thing for challenges that we have around the application of AI to cultural heritage data sets.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be fantastic. And I mean, in fact, even as you say, you're a humanist, but it seems, I mean, I'm thinking about that recent article by Thomas Smits and Melvin Webers on computer vision and optical instruments. It seems to be more and more the humanists getting into this area that are pointing out the kind of ways in which data practices are rather unscientific around machine learning. So maybe there's a place, particularly for libraries and information science and that. So I wanted to bring in a really more of a comment from Nora McGregor about, this is following up on that topic of upskilling. She's talking about how important it is, but also there is an emphasis in the technical skills that are required, and not as much an emphasis on how important it is to, for, say, subject experts or the particular skills and technical services and that sort of thing that are extraordinarily relevant to this area, to just see how they can contribute. And I'm pointing to this in part too because this is a great interest of mine, which is why I brought up this interest in anti-racist description. This is the community, this is the way they're thinking. There's so much overlap in the needs that doesn't require necessarily much more than just simply learning about the basics of how much of machine learning functions, to recognize that the skills and expertise that you already have are extremely relevant to this field and to making this work more robust. Any thoughts about that? How do we make sure that when we focus on upskilling, that it's not just about focusing on technical expertise?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. The technical expertise on its own is wholly insufficient, right? Like you can't have collaboration just with a tool. You have to have a relationship and ability to communicate. And I think one of the things it's going to sound really simple, but I think is just really important is, read outside of your area, go to talks that are not a talk that you might typically go to, because it's all part of establishing sort of that shared language and being able to broker connections between different sub-communities within your organization. And that's so important. I think that's one thing. I think the second thing for me is as much as possible when you're thinking about collaboration or potential, try and think about how to frame that in as generative as a way as possible. So like one of the things that like really drives me nuts around, some of the writing, not just in the private sector, but also in our sector around the potential of AI, is sometimes it suggests there's all this like doom and gloom kind of stuff around obsolescence and like getting rid of jobs and threatening stuff, a bunch of like threat stuff and scale. We're going to scale stuff, and I in another presentation I had this slide of the most recent Mad Max movie with like there's a guy on a guitar and a big flaming vehicle going through the desert, and he's like jamming out and there's flames going everywhere. He's going really fast, and that's the image I get in my head when I see things that are written like that. I'm just like, how ridiculous and counterproductive. So I like generative things, right? So I think, Nicole, one of the things I really appreciate about your work is about the work that you've done to articulate this notion of libraries being in a really strong natural position to manage bias in computational work with collections. And I really appreciated the work that you did in our conversations, and then also in that article to say, well, really when you think about it, the notion of like managing bias in AI or whatever, like we're perfectly prepared to do that. It's exactly what libraries are in the business of doing and have been doing. Everything from description to collection development to instruction to, it's like we're all involved in this bias management activity. And so the challenge has been how do we come together? And I think that your work by suggesting that people actually have been doing the great work, are prepared to do the great work, and can do the great work with these emerging challenges around these technologies is super positive. I think it's really important that we be generative in our thinking. And lastly, sometimes for me, it just breaks down to just encouraging people to ask questions like, why are we doing this? And what if we did it this way?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's fantastic. I think we have a few more minutes, I think, right? And we do have a few more questions, so if you're willing.
Yeah.
So again, Adrian Stevenson, he asks if you have any thoughts on how to address the climate change challenge for AI, given the considerable energy consumption requirements. We know there's been a lot of focus on this from various angles. I imagine with your interest in this work, you've given some thought to this as well.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm just seeing a comment in the chat. Let me see. I think it's related to the question. Huh. I mean, one of my thoughts has to do with, in terms of the climate impact question, has to do with, someone asked me for a concrete recommendation about like how to get started. And I think the collective action around data set development and refinement of method could help address some of the climate challenge as well, in a small way at least, if we just don't keep running the same jobs on the same collections over and over again, just duplicating effort.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
Yeah.
do we really all need to pay AWS millions of dollars every year to train on the same kinds of collections?
Yes. Yeah. No, excellent point.
Yeah,
Right.
Probably not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the hidden scalability costs of cloud computing, it seemed like that would rank high. There there was that comment from James Capobianco saying there's been pushback about this overstated energy use of AI. It's interesting. This is a discussion for sure that's going on, because on one hand, of course, people are going to say overstated use, and on the other hand, it's like, look, we've been too late attending to this in the past. Let's be aware of what we're getting ourselves into.
Yeah, and I think this is where Anna Singh, like the non-scalability lens, is like really helpful, right? Because it's so easy to just send a job to AWS and it'll happen. It's scaling and probably dozens of processors or hundreds of processors. It's all happening, but at what cost, right? At what cost? And so I think that there's the climate dimension to that. I also think that there's an equity dimension as well, in the sense of like what institutions can participate in this conversation that we're having about, like how many institutions can afford to pay those AWS costs or to pay Azure costs. And so I think that there's additional work to do there as well. Like, is there any kind of load balancing of the investment that creates more entryways for less well-resourced institutions to make use of these methods with their collections? I think that's another sort of challenge area for our community.
A related issue, and I know your work has always been very much people first, and considering the cost in terms of how it's affecting people and work. What about the use essentially what at least I see as kind of outsourcing what would be professional library work to labeling, say via Mechanical Turk, or just these kind of annotation farms where people are given not only probably not at all well paid, but also no instruction, no guidance, no oversight. And how does that relate to the work of libraries, deprofessionalizing work of libraries, versus an opportunity for libraries to really step forward and show the importance and the value?
Yeah, I that's a fantastic question. I think for me, rather than seeing some of these things as deprofessionalization, I see it as opportunities to for current professionals to have different kinds of impact. So if I'm thinking about CRL, for example, over the years, well, I'll just say one of the things that we're considering currently is maybe doing less cataloging in technical services and doing more what we're calling open knowledge analytics. So basically having folks that have those technical services skills really focus on analysis of metadata, I'm going to say at scale, in our community, in order to provide insights around like how resources are being shared in the United States. So it's a pivoting from description to open infrastructure, open knowledge analytics. And we're really seeing that as an opportunity in our technical services group.
Well, I think we're getting near the end of time. So to close up, I want to come back. Daniel Venstren brought up this. He wanted to bring us back to questions about how we interact with and use AI as a sector without waiting or hoping for governments to legislate. So this gets to this point about, whether we should legislate. What about collective action essentially without legislation? And I'd like to also sort of frame that as bringing back Melissa's question to you. You in your new position, how are you going to advocate? How would you answer that question today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in my position currently, I'm also an incoming chair in the scholarly communication group for our National Association for Research Libraries, ACRL. And this will be something that I advocate for at board meetings. This will be something that I advocate for at our various associations, ARL, CNI, ALA, ACRL, Digital Library Federation. That's what I'll be doing. I'll be trying to basically lobby my potential lobbyists to do that work. And I think in lieu of having that regulatory environment in the U.S., I'll be paying a lot of close attention to how regulation is playing out in the European Union, and as well as the critiques. I mentioned the well-founded critiques from Michael Veal, and a number of other prominent AI practitioners are also problematizing the viability of legislation to address some of these issues. I think the big challenge for anyone that wants to do the right thing is trying to triangulate a path forward, honestly, at this point, because there's problems with everything.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This is fantastic, a wonderful talk, and good guidelines for all of us going forward. I imagine there are going to be more questions coming from you for you after this, and I imagine people can contact you directly.
Yep, definitely.
All right.